Check, check. Okay, great. We're live. Well, thank you all for coming out. Feel free to change seats if you want, because we've got a lot of empty seats up front here. And you don't have to stay in the back row just out of habit, but you can sit wherever you want. I'm up on stage here because we are videotaping this. Some people were wondering if they could see it online on the church website, so we're hoping to make that available. That's kind of why I'm up here on the platform. So yeah, I got to go to Ukraine, and thank you all for the prayers and support. And why don't I just pray before we jump into this? Father, I just thank you that you put us in a big, wide world with a big gospel that's for all people. We pray for people in Ukraine today. Pray for the Russians there who want to be back home. Lord, we pray for what's going on in Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, Israel. Lord, may the fears and dangers of this life stir people to look to you for life and hope and peace. And Lord, would you help us to remember what's most important in life. Amen. Amen. Okay, so a little bit of background here. Why did I want to go to Ukraine of all places? Some of you have met my mother-in-law Kathy, father-in-law Art. They were ministry South Minneapolis for their entire career. And in the latter part of their ministry, God opened up a door for them to go to Kenya, and they developed what I'd call a short-term, long-term commitment, where they went to Kenya about 15 times over about as many years. And Art was coaching Christian nonprofit organizations, doing community development, and Kathy was doing educational ministry. And I'll never forget a picture of my mother-in-law in a full-length dress, because you're in Africa and you have to dress accordingly, no matter how hot it is. And she's on the back of a dirt bike because that is their Uber equivalent. They call them a picky. And she's in the outback of Kenya. And I'm like, what kind of mother-in-law do I have? She's like fearless. Anyway, so I had been praying about that for a couple of years, to be honest. Lord, would you ever have anything for me outside of my normal ministry? Lord willing, without needing to leave Calvary, but something that would be outside the box. So I'd been following the Ukraine war really since 2014. And basically I'd been praying, Lord, would there ever be an avenue there for short-term mission? I really didn't know what that could look like. But Calvary does support a faith community nurse, Pam DeAndre, over there, and she's been there 20 to 30 years. She was back a year ago in the spring, and I said, Pam, would there ever be a place for a pastor to come do short-term mission work there? And she said, well, we're training chaplains. The Ukrainian military does not have a history of an officer class chaplaincy corps like in the U.S. military, and they're trying to develop it. But in the meantime, all of their hospital chaplaincy is being done by either pastors or a lot of lay leaders. And the thing to understand about Ukraine right now, the whole society's in a scramble. So picture if, maybe 100 people from Calvary just left the country, and then picture, Pastor Matthew got deployed, and maybe, Chris, is MIA somewhere or a POW, and, imagine you've got a few elders who are leading the church, and half the church is gone, but then the church fills back up again with internally placed refugees, and they need work and housing and trauma care, and so the whole thing is a tossed salad. So Pam said, we're training classes of chaplains, and here's who you should call, and she put me in touch with a guy named Steve Smeltzer. Steve is a second career guy who's 7 years old. He worked IBM Technology his whole career. I asked him, what did you do for IBM? He said, I was director of global sales for a while. So he operated at a fairly high level, and he just finished a master's degree at seminary, and he's getting his licensing with a free church, and he's doing trauma care through what's called Reach Global. That's the missions branch of the AFCA. And he's with a particular team called Crisis Relief. And so Steve has done 15 trips to Ukraine in 3 years. He's basically there 3 or 4 weeks, home a month, back and forth. So that's his life right now, and he's developed a great love for the people. And Steve had, when I contacted him, found out he's been praying for about a year because he'd like there to be 10 or 12 pastors going with him on a regular basis because he is 70 years old and he's not going to be able to do this forever. And so he was looking to develop a team, Lord willing. So the part that ended up being a lot more complicated than I ever thought was because of the war, even mission agencies have to have insurance policies, and the insurance agency won't let them take volunteers. So I had to become a fully hired staff member of EFCA Reach Global Mission. So my side gig is I'm a part-time missionary. Very part-time and no paycheck, but I had to go through a full hiring process, interviews. It was a lot, but there's obviously reasons why it has to be not a simple process. But anyway, so long story short, we had a 2-week trip in May, and we operated almost entirely in the city of Kyiv. This is the main city square in Kyiv, and this is a war memorial. So if you see politicians having photo ops in Kyiv, this is where they happen. There's a bunch of war wreckage that they've dragged in as kind of a memorial, basically. So that's a shot-up Soviet tank from 2022. They've got a bunch of that stuff in the main city square. And the thing to understand about the trip is, like, if you go, 95% of what you see looks pretty normal. Lights are on, stores are full, school's in session, churches meeting, the park is full, all that stuff is going on. But the other 5% is war memorials and a lot of guys in uniform and other venues where you don't see hardly any young guys. And tank blockades at all major intersections, that kind of stuff. So you never forget there's a war going on, but people work really hard to have an ordinary life. So, and this is kind of the contrast, because in the back you'll see a beautiful Orthodox cathedral that's like, I'm not joking, 1,000 years old. And it's like if you were going there on a vacation trip, that's where you'd go for all your pictures. And it's just beautiful. I mean, it's just absolutely glorious. If you have 1,000 years to build something, you can do a really good job. and you know, just so much of the city and countryside was absolutely gorgeous. This is the memorial there, Freedom is what that says if you can't make it out. But, you know, the thing I would say about the people is, you know, they speak a different language and they're just like us. You know, they just want to be able to take their wife out for coffee and the kids go to school and not get an air raid siren in the middle of church. The country was formerly under Soviet domination. When the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine became independent. They are a democracy. They do have historically a state church like Russia would have, an Orthodox, Greek Orthodox roots. A lot of similarities and significant differences from Roman Catholicism. But the other thing that happened when the wall came down is every mission agency in the entire world wanted to get into Eastern Europe. And they were so desperate, high school principals would invite missionaries in to speak to high school gatherings because they recognized that 2 generations of communism had left them morally and ethically bankrupt, and they needed a spiritual foundation. So the result of that is there are lots of churches in Ukraine and across the Eastern Bloc that are what we would call young churches. They're 15 to 30-year-old congregations. A lot of them would be Baptist, Charismatic, Assembly of God, Evangelical. And a lot of them would be in situations that we would call storefronts. So maybe you've got a church that's 50 to 150 people in a non-traditional building. would be pretty typical. And a lot of them, frankly, they were singing the same stuff we do, just in another language. They would have recognized everything in our worship set, and same with me being there. So you do see a lot of these. That's a war memorial. Each one of those is a photograph of a lost soldier. And this, again, would be in the main square there. And you find these marked with flags and photographs, city parks, churches, public buildings. They're all over the place. And a lot of them we'll talk about later, but they really are trying to maintain the stories, the actual stories of who these people are and what they went through. But, this is a wall of pictures that's a block and a half long. And one of the things that's interesting when you go from a U.S. background is we bring soldiers into the Army at age 18 to 21, and if they stay in 20 years, they're pretty well out by age 45 unless they're an officer or a high-level NCO. They don't start their draft until age 25. They don't want to lose all their generation of young people. So there are guys on that wall from age 25, 35, 45, 55, 65. And if you're fighting for your country, there are guys out there fighting and dying who we would look and we'd be like, oh, you're 10 or 15 or 20 years too late. Not if you're fighting for your country, because they got nowhere else to go. So it's really a full age spectrum of people who are deployed, who are missing from regular society, and are out on the front. That's a Soviet ballistic missile. Now, why can I have my picture taken by it? Somebody guess. Somebody tell me. Doug knows. It didn't blow up. And there are a fair number of these around, because one of the things you have to understand about the Soviet military is Vladimir Putin is a thief and a murderer and a liar, and he has created an entire society that is rife with corruption from top to bottom. And one of the things that happens when you try and run a military that's rife with corruption is equipment does not get maintained and people do not get trained. And so there was another place, in a place we called Brovary. There was a big cemetery in back of the community center. A rocket landed in there and never went off. It's not entirely uncommon. Because you'll have maintenance pools of tanks and, they talk about, well, the Russians have, 50,000 tanks. Some of those tanks were manufactured in the 50s and have been sitting in storage, which means like out in an empty lot for 20 years. How well do you think that they run? So this is a car that was operated by a civilian Ukrainian. He was rescuing people. When they came in 2022, they tried to capture Kyiv. They came in from the north. They tried to cut off the city. And there's just story after story of like ordinary Ukrainians just trying to rescue people, get people out. There was a young guy who died in that car after shuttling people out of a city that was under artillery fire. This is just some paperwork. Top there says security team. So when you go with the missions organization, you get all the benefits of the team, and you do get all the team rules. And the team rules are designed to keep the team intact. So everything that we did had to be approved by a 6-member security team. So it was honestly pretty humbling being in a Zoom meeting with these people, because, there's like one guy who's like, well, I'm in charge of free church security for missionaries in Africa. And another guy was like, well, I've been the director of Eastern Europe for 20 years. I'm like, what am I doing in this room? But, these people have been at it a long time. But they know what they're doing. And so I had to have some apps downloaded on my phone. Basically, our location was monitored 24/7, and we had to check in at least once a day. And our itinerary from beginning to end had to be approved. And basically, if you're watching the news, you'll see apartments getting hit by drones in Kyiv, and then you'll see stuff happening out on the front lines. And we were 400 miles away from the front lines. They don't allow any missionaries to go that direction. Anyway, they're very conscientious about safety because they have career missionaries there, and they make determinations literally on a daily basis if they can stay or if they need to relocate. So like I said, 95% of the country you wouldn't recognize that necessarily a war's going on, but there are exceptions. So what you're looking at, the big, I don't even know what the big dark box with the scaffolding, that's a historical monument that's shielded. And so as you go through Kyiv, like any capital city, it's full of monuments and historical markers. And so they wrap those all up in plywood to protect them from shrapnel. And that's a pretty typical. But again, I just want to show you the contrast. You can't really shield, a cathedral with gold leaf roof. So that's totally exposed, but then the memorial 200 yards away is buried in plywood to protect it. And that bizarre contrast is like every day, everywhere. That's just another Soviet vehicle or Russian vehicle that got shot up in the invasion. And then you got these. It was tulip time in Kyiv. Their spring runs about the same time as Iowa. Lilacs were in bloom. Honestly, it was beautiful. Driving train across the country, you could have been going through Iowa, only you'd have to turn the clock back 50 to 60 years in terms of the size of the farms, the type of equipment that they have available. As far as agriculture, it's a rich country in terms of land resource, but coming out of Soviet domination, they have a long ways to go in development. The median income in Ukraine is $5,500 a year. You got that on one side, and on the other hand, about every other young guy I met was in either computer IT or high-tech development or all this kind of stuff. So it's like, no wonder they're winning the drone war, because they've got their technology figured out pretty well. I didn't see a paper menu the entire time I was there. If you go to Kyiv or Ukraine, you better know how to operate the QR codes, because that's where your menu's at. Which is actually pretty cool, because then you can bring it up in English, and that's kind of helpful. Transportation, commercial flights don't go into Kyiv. You fly into Poland or Hungary, and then you get on a train. So that stretches out the time length, because basically adds an extra day of travel on each leg of the trip. And the trains look like they were built in the 1960s, because they were probably built in the 1960s. And, they were fine. They were adequate. There was nothing wrong with them. But you find that there is, on the one hand, a lot of stuff that you would call very contemporary, modern, current, but infrastructure always looks like it's 30 years behind the curve. So this is Steve Smeltzer. He's the guy I was telling you about who worked for IBM. Now he's doing mission work, basically on his own dime. And great guy, very enthusiastic, tremendous gift for encouragement. And he's, because of his career background, he's super comfortable traveling anywhere in the world. He's lived in London, he lived in Saudi Arabia, he lived in Indonesia for a time. So it's just fascinating how God prepares people and gives people backgrounds to then come in to play for ministry when the time is right, in a way that he couldn't have anticipated. So I mentioned team, playing for the team. You get all the team assets, but you also get team rules. One of the team rules is you have the air raid siren on your phone. So the air raid siren, we'll see if we can do the test here. Of course, I've got to put my glasses on and make it work. They wanted us to take cover, which is basically go to the basement every time the siren goes off. And the only problem with that is the siren goes off a lot. And so,
attention, air raid alert.
The weird thing about it is, like, the Ukrainians are really done living in the basement. So you have to think about air raids, and I'll come back to this later. There's your phone goes off, which means something is flying at like your county. And then there's neighborhood sirens, which means maybe something's coming to your neighborhood. And then there's noise. Boom, boom. And we didn't have much of that. We had one loud night. But because of the missions agency, their rules and protocols, they're like, if your phone goes off, you go to the basement, you know. So there was one night, it was like 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And by the time morning woke up, I found out why some of those prayers where David's praying like, God, would you punch them in the face? I got to say, that's kind of how I was praying for Putin that day. So this is class in the basement. That's the bomb shelter. Those red seats back there are some recliner seats they put in the back for if you're down there at 4 in the morning. And we're having our chaplaincy program down in the class. Now, the thing is, like the Ukrainian ladies at the front desk, they're still there. And the cleaning ladies, they're coming out. They're still cleaning the hallways upstairs. You're like, why are we in the basement? So it's one of those things where there's a contrast of, if I tell you, well, the air raid sirens go off, it's like, oh my gosh, that must be dangerous. But if you've lived with it for 3 years and they're flying 24 drones and you're in a place like a 5-county region the size of the Twin Cities metro, you know, after a few nights, you're tired of going to the basement and you kind of press on with whatever you're doing. So there was one night where 9 o'clock, beautiful warm evening, parks are full. Our hotel was right near a nice park. Kids, playground, teenagers, little dogs everywhere. I'm going to go for a walk. Phone goes off. Shoot. I go back to the basement. Well, everybody who's in the park, they just keep doing what they're doing because it's just the phone. But the next night, you know, was real stuff. Then stuff was flying in and going boom. But a long ways away, nothing near our neighborhood. And then you turn around and go like that. After class, let's go out to eat. And this was like a kickin' restaurant. I'm telling you, this was a Georgian restaurant, not Georgia, America, the other Georgia. And this is our class and instructors and students. And so that's just the bizarre contrast of the whole thing, because everybody around that table would have a story of somebody who they lost in the war, somebody deployed, somebody missing in action, somebody back injured. Every one of them would have stories. But we had a really nice supper. And it's just really weird holding all that contrast together. So this is Pam DeAndre. She's a career faith community nurse there, woman of God. Pray for her every day. She raised her kids over there. They're in the U.S. now. She wants to stay. But there's a lot of nights when she's sleeping out in the hallway because it's away from the windows. This guy's Victor. He'd probably be about my age or a little older. He would be a veteran of the Afghan war when Ukraine was still under Soviet domination. So he knows what it's like to be a soldier, and now basically he's what we would consider an elder, and he's doing hospital visitation in hotels. This guy was a vet too. His last day on the front lane, a drone flew over and something went off, and he had shrapnel in his leg and his arm, and that would have been about 1.5 years ago, and now he's doing chaplain work. And he's the pastor of the church now, whereas 3 years ago he would have been like, well, maybe we'll make you an elder someday. And because of the scramble, now he's leading the congregation with very little training. He's another one of those IT guys. You know, techie as the day is long. Young believer, but he's leading the church as best he can. So we'll just kind of walk you through. Young gal there, I think she was about 30. And when they go into the hospitals, a lot of times they're visiting troops, but obviously they're also visiting civilians, women, kids, you name it, whoever's been injured. So we had a class of about a dozen students. And that's been typical. They've done as groups as small as 6 and as big as 30. And because they want a lot of interaction and because of the translation issues, you know, 10 to 20 is probably about ideal. How did I teach? Because I don't really speak Ukrainian. Because of the nature of the economy and the strength of the U.S. dollar, you can hire a college-educated translator with great English for $25 a day. And so honestly, the big ticket price was just getting there and getting home. Once you're in country, it's a pretty economical place for an Americano to show up, to be honest. There's a guy named Sasha. He pastors a little church out in a rural village. When the Russians came down back in 2022, all the stuff you would have seen on TV, he was using his minivan to shuttle residents of a home for the mentally challenged. He was shuttling people out a carload at a time to get them out of the path of the tanks and everything. So, pretty remarkable guy. This was a Soviet era. So this was a Ukrainian hospital, would be considered standard. It would have been built in the Soviet era. If you walked into it, you'd think, was this built in the 60s or was it built in the 50s? And as far as like a refresh, nope, that hasn't really happened yet. So in a lot of ways, their medical stuff is good in terms of training and medicine available, but facilities are extremely different from what we would experience. So this is a crew of guys. If you picture a room that we would put 2 hospital beds in, they had 6 hospital beds in there. And these guys all had leg injuries from the front. The guy in back flexing the arm, he's the guy I was preaching about one Sunday, used for an illustration. GoPro soldier. His whole war is on his phone. And his last day, his leg got blown off. He'd been fighting for 7 years. He's probably about 30 years old. He wants to go back. They'll give him a new foot, but he's not going to go back. And interesting, you know, he was the guy who he saw us chaplains come in, and the first thing he said is, "Oh, Paul and Timothy here." Interesting, huh? So you know a little Bible. I don't believe in God anymore. My grandma used to read me the Bible. I lost my faith. And it's really interesting because they always tell you the guy who tells you first thing that he's lost his faith is the guy who's going to talk more than anybody else in the room. And, you know, we did training to be ready and try and have some answers. And because of what they've been through, you could hit any type of emotion, mentality, mood, anything from tell you my whole life story to I don't want to say a word. These guys were all ready to talk. Frankly, they were bored out of their minds and happy for company. And we didn't have to work at all to get them to like open up and talk. Because when you go as a chaplain, the main thing you're going to do is listen. And at the end, you'll ask if you can read some scripture or pray. And they're pretty open to that. But really, we're not going there to fix anybody. We're going there to listen to them and love them, let them know somebody cares about them. And, you know, God's not done with that young guy. He lost his faith for a while, but he'll be back because God's after him. So, and then you go outside and you go to the park, and kids are playing in the park. And on that particular day, I went for a walk because if you remember back in early May, Putin had his big holiday parade, 3 days of tanks and bring in China and the North Koreans and everybody. And it was pretty quiet for those days. And then after that, Zelensky had in like 6 European leaders. So in town, in the same neighborhood, you've got, you know, Emmanuel Macron and the leader of Germany and the UK. Well, they're all in town. So for our training time, for when the pastors come, we were like in the Motel 8. Like, you know, it was sufficient. It was fine. You know, it was pretty economical, to put it mildly. But then we left there to go downtown because Steve is the IBM guy, right? And he had 6,500 nights in Marriott's over his career. And so guess what? When Steve goes to the hotel, he gets the Steve deal. And if you get the Steve deal, man, it's a deal. This was not hardship duty, this part. This was like the fanciest hotel I'd ever been in my life. Unbelievable. And half the people there are wearing suits. They work for companies or the government. And the other half are contractors, which means they look like Division I tight ends with tattoos, and they keep talking into their sleeves. And you could walk out the door that day, and because they're all in town, the bomb dogs are around, and they're pulling manhole covers, and shoving cameras down there, and you could throw a rock in any direction. And I don't mean hit one. I mean, oh, look, 20 security guards over there. Oh, there's 20 contractors over there. Oh, there's 20 cops. I told Kara, it's a good day to look really innocent because, like, if you get pulled over, you're going to be there a while. But you got all that stuff going on, and the park's full. And the kids are having a good time, and the grandparents are walking the dog, and the ice cream man's busy, and people are just trying to live their life as normal as they can. Now, this was in Kyiv, and that's only part. So we did have a day when we went up to Mushan. And Mushan was one of the northwest suburb villages that got ripped apart 3 years ago. So when we were in Kyiv, I hardly saw any building damage, and what I did was from 3 years ago. But if you go to Mushan, it's 85% demolished. And bless the Rotarians, they filled that place up with tiny homes, and these are built for $12,500 each, and there are hundreds of them. So they're about the size of your fish house, and that's what Granny's living on, or maybe that's what the single mom and the kids are living in, or the young couple, or the retirement. I mean, they're about 10 feet by 15, and it's going to be a long time before that town gets put together again. But there's a lot of fighting spirit left, to put it mildly. I never heard anybody say, quit, we're done, we should surrender, give up, none of that. No. If you go into the community center in the same town, that's the floor mat. Anybody recognize those colors? That would be the Russian flag that they're wiping their feet on. You can also get mud mats that have Vladimir Putin's face on it. Those are a pretty popular hot ticket item. And I really wish I would have grabbed one when I had the opportunity. I'll have to order one off Amazon. But all that to say, they're weary. Yes, they're tired. They've been through a lot. It's been going on for a long time. But they have nowhere else to go, and this is their country, and they want their freedom. So quitting is not really an option. You can die or run out of ammunition, but giving up is not part of the plan. A lot of artwork. You see artwork all over the place, often out in public, murals on buildings. You go to a city park, and there'll be a wall as long as this room, and they'll just have different prints and oil paintings and just, stuff that people have done from the community, and they just go out to post it. You see that kind of stuff all over the place. And sometimes, honestly, the artwork captures more than a news story ever could. That's the welcome sign on that village I was telling you about, Mushan. This is the one that really got me. I showed that one in church. You can't see it from this picture, but the leg that she's pulling up behind her, the ballerina, it's a prosthetic. So some of you maybe saw that on that Sunday sermon. And so it's just fascinating, the power of art to express what's inside people, whether it's pain, hope, dread, all kinds of things. It's pretty powerful. So this is in the same community. That would have been an operable building 3 years ago. This is the high-rise building that Pam DeAndre lives in. Again, it'd be Soviet era, probably built in the 50s or 60s. I've never been in an elevator like that before. And I've been in some elevators. But, Pam lives with and among the people. And if you're in the city of Kyiv, usually you're seeing buildings like this that got hit. Because as near as I can tell, like, the Russians can't seem to hit anything smaller than like a city. And I really do mean that. I follow the war pretty well every day. When you see attacks that hit, always ask, what is it they are hitting? Now, the Ukrainians, they got a lot of big publicity. Oh, we hit a bunch of strategic bombers. Or, we blew up a general outside his apartment building. Or, we're hitting a munitions plant. They basically fly drones and rockets and just aim at the city. And the city is covered with high-rise Soviet-era apartment buildings that are super cheap, where ordinary people live. They're 6 to 30 stories tall. They're all over the city as far as you can see. And that's what they're aiming at. They're not aiming at that building. I just don't think they have the technological capability because they can't hit bridges. Bridges are fine. They can't hit the government buildings. They're all intact. They can't hit the water supply or the electrical supply. Anything that would be a target of strategic value, they seem to be incapable of hitting. So again, I circle that back to if you just see numbers, oh, the Ukrainians can never win because the Russians just have too much. It matters how much you have and the quality of what you have and the training of the people using what you have. So there were stories from Ukrainian soldiers who had captured Russian POWs, and these poor young kids told stories of having 1 day of training before being sent to the front. And they were given a rifle and 2 bullets to practice, and the next day you're leading the charge. And so when you see the body count numbers, that's why it is the way it is. They're mowing them down 1,000 a week. And the problem is Putin has no end of supply, but the insanity of it all is that for both Russia and Ukraine, you will never win a war even by mowing down 1,000 troops a week. They've already hit 1 million casualties on the Russian side. There's no end of that. So that's why, I'm a pastor from northern Minnesota. I'm not a war historian, but for the U.S. to provide weapons that can hit strategic targets deep in Russia, that's the only thing that'll change the equation, because you can send them bullets forever and they'll just stay right where they're at. It's just basically what the Russians do is they send out a wave of troops to attack, the Ukrainians fire back, and then that gives the Russians targets for drones or artillery. And that tactic is basically World War I warfare in the modern age with drones. These are landmine warning signs, same village. They'll be digging mines out of that country for the rest of my lifetime, probably my kids' lifetime. And they're training civilians on how to do it. I heard a radio story one day, this 40-year-old mom, and she works with a whole team of moms, and basically they're being trained to demine their own neighborhoods. So, but that's the volume that you're talking about, that it's like nobody's coming to do this for us. We have to figure out how to do it ourselves. I mentioned the war memorials earlier. You see these all over the place where you get like a big picture, like that poster was probably 3 by 4 foot tall, and it tells this woman's story. She was taken prisoner, held for, I forget how many, 6 or 12 months or whatever before she was released. One of the terrible things about being taken POW is the Russians don't notify anybody. So you don't know if your loved one is dead or alive, if they're injured or healthy. And so they're just doing a pretty amazing job telling people's stories, because, you walk through Kyiv and there are hundreds and hundreds of these. You'll walk up to a city square or a park and there'll be 30 of them lined up. And I mean, you'd be out there all day if you read them all. But they want it to be told. They want those stories to be heard. There's another one, a gal who's waiting for her husband to come home. She's hoping he's alive. She doesn't know. She's praying he is. But that's pretty common. Back at the community center in Mushan, there was a couple, probably your age, George. They were showing us the community. She was the lady who you could tell was the life of the town. She's like the arts director for the community program. She would be like running all the musicals and the concerts. He's kind of the serious type. He put the building back on the roof after it got shot apart, and she's like, now we're going to have a concert. And but they've got a son they haven't heard from in 12 months, and they don't know if he's dead or alive. But they're praying he's alive, and they're waiting for word. And that's why these prisoner exchanges are so huge, because every family out there doesn't know, will this be the time they win the lottery and they get their family member back. So that'd be the same village, and I could have taken pictures of hundreds of those. But basically, the eastern area of the country that's under artillery bombardment there will be entire counties that look just like that. Because basically their approach is we just burn it all down. And it's, in terms of warfare, strategic capability, it's pretty primitive. And they'll be rebuilding for our kids' lifetime. So this is what pops up on the phone if your air ride, that's a screenshot from my phone. So Ukraine is about the size of Texas. So each one of those oblasts, they call them, that would be like our equivalent of a county. And so that's the problem with the phone warnings. The advantage is there's enough technology and radar now where when the Russians put anything in the air, the Ukrainians know right now. And they start tracking where it's going. But it warns you by your entire county because they can't inform like your neighborhood. So that's why the phones are helpful, because literally they'll tell you it'll be arriving in about 20 minutes. And I mean, they can tell you we're expecting drones or we think there's 3 rockets. It's amazing what they can figure out. And, you know, largely because of American and NATO support, the Ukrainians do have some very strong, capable anti-aircraft stuff. But now with all this stuff in Israel and Iran, there is a limited supply, even in the US of A. So, you know, you can't protect anything anywhere you go. And so people ask me if I was safe. I never once had a time when I thought I was in danger. You can ask Kara. The thing that I was most worried about was that I would land in Krakow, Poland with a dead phone, and I wouldn't be able to Uber or call Steve or use Google Translate, and I'd be totally lost in a foreign country. Because when we travel, I do the luggage. I'm like security and muscle, and Kara is the brains. Kara knows the passwords. She calls up the Uber. She does all that stuff. I had to learn how to do things for this. It was really challenging. But honestly, I was never in a situation where I would have been uncomfortable with Kara or our kids there, literally. Like I said, we had one loud night where you could hear stuff way off in the distance, and we were in the basement. But other than that, the thing is that was really interesting is Pam DeAndre, the missionary there, she did a fascinating seminar workshop for these guys, for the chaplains, on how we respond to trauma and how you minister to people with trauma. And one of the things that she highlighted is that your brain and your eyeballs are geared to pick up cues from every face in your vicinity. So when you come into any room anywhere in the world, you're constantly looking for safety or danger. Is this safe or dangerous? Can these people be trusted? Should I run? Do I have to fight? Your brain automatically does that all the time, everywhere you go. So if you've been through a war zone or you've been traumatized, your brain's a little whacked out because you're prone to seeing danger everywhere, even if it's not there. But the flip side of it is your community will also tell you whether this is safe or reassuring. So if I'm, as I was, in church or at the restaurant, and the phone siren goes off, and I look around the room, well, we just keep on singing because we're in church. Or this is a good dinner. We're not going to the basement now. This food's hot. And you take your social cues from the people in your surrounding. And so that's one reason why I could have my phone going off air raid sirens, but this is subordinate to real life people in the room. The real life people in the room are what your brain really trusts. And it's like, oh, we're okay. God's in charge. Doesn't mean something terrible couldn't happen, but you know what? We're probably going to be fine. And that's how people exist. This is one of the churches we went to, a little Baptist congregation, 60 people, storefront scenario. Rock and roll motorcycle man got up with his guitar and sang "Our God is an Awesome God" in Ukrainian. It was awesome. I'm looking around the churches and I'm like, oh, that's Lexi. Oh, that guy's like Chris, but this part is different. Every week they stand up and read all the names of troops deployed, missing, POWs, injured. Not just from that congregation, but literally like all the guys they know. So picture the guys from your work, your neighbor, co-workers. Church of 60 people, there was 160 names on that list. And they read every one of them every week. And that was pretty sobering. That kind of gives you the reality that you don't get to see visibly. And like I said, then after that, we go to dinner. And that was another awesome restaurant. I don't want to portray this as too much hardship duty. There were some stressful things, and there were a lot of things to figure out. But I didn't lose any weight, I'll tell you that. But that's in a place called Brovary, and they're on a main flight line for drones and rockets between Russia and Kyiv. And, the phones go off all the time there, and they're like, just eat dinner. Just live your life. So that part was actually one of the biggest impressions it made on me, is how much people are committed to try and live what we would call a normal life, even when circumstances are not normal. I preached on Job. My chaplain training was on the lament psalms of anger, hurt, pain, crying out to God, and then passages on Job where he's kind of doing the same. And it's interesting because in America, we will use a lot of the psalms we like, which tend to be happy ones. And a lot of us, especially if we're new to the Bible, we really struggle with the lament psalms. We're like, man, why did they put that in the Bible? Or that's so depressing. Or can you really talk that way to God? All this stuff. And that would be an area where the Ukrainians are a lot like us. They're not any different in that regard. Because they hear the same messages. Well, you should be happy all the time and wear your blessed shirt everywhere you go and don't have any bad days and, whatever you do, don't get mad at God. And, but the reality is, they've been hurt a lot. They've lost a lot. They've got a lot of stuff they've got to pray out because they carry a lot of pain and they're not meant to carry it. You're meant to give it to God, to unload it. And if you don't pray it out, what are you going to do with it? So that's what we talked about. This guy's named Michael. He was one of the other pastors along with. He was a career Presbyterian pastor down in Des Moines. He's with another branch of Free Church Missions. They do preaching training for pastors in second and third world environments where there's no academic training available. So he's been all over Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And basically, they come in and teach pastors how to do Bible study that turns into expository preaching sermons like you get. Because otherwise, the way these guys learn is they go on YouTube and they listen to a guy and then they kind of do that. And you might get a winner or you might not. And so they're trying to teach them how to get into the Bible, observe, interpret, apply. Basically the same thing that your youth group leaders are doing here every Wednesday night. So, and that's about the end of the presentation. But that's what they want, They want to not be under Russian dominion because Putin and the oligarchs have already robbed of Russia, everything of value. And they do it by lying and murdering people and poisoning people and throwing people out of buildings. I'll take that just a moment, Nancy. I see you there. And they know what they'll get if they end up under Russian dominion. And Putin is committed to reestablishing Russian dominance over Eastern Europe like the Soviet Union had for 3 generations. Except it's not communism anymore. It's really, I heard one guy call it a kleptocracy. You're familiar with klepto, what do they call it? Kleptomaniac has to steal everything. It's a kleptocracy. He's worth about $160 billion, and he'll kill anybody to get it and keep it. But it's never going to be enough. It's not enough.